Hi, this is Uncle JJ talking again, and this video sort of follows up on the story about how the Browns and Hadlocks came to America, and also on the video about the Kirtland reunion, where I talk about how Grandpa Brown's side, the Browns and the Johnsons, both came up out of the Mexican colonies, and that the Johnsons and Browns stayed together and met, kind of joined in marriage with Grandma Maggie Johnson and Earl Marion Brown in the Mesa area after they came up out of Mexico. Earl and Maggie had their first child, Uncle Marvin, and then, when living in Chandler, which is just south of Mesa, living in sort of a tent home, they had Grandpa Robert L. Brown. This is what Chandler looked like in 1931 when Grandpa Brown was born there. And you can see that the people had cars, but they were very early versions of cars. And thank goodness they did have cars because Grandpa's dad made a living keeping the books at the local car dealership there. Here's some of the aerial views of Chandler during that time. Earl was not bad at keeping the books for the car dealership and eventually even started his own car company with his brother. The car business wasn't really his thing, though, so Earl eventually left the business to his brother, who got another partner. I remember Dad telling me that his brother then partnered up with another man named Brown, and it became Brown and Brown Chevrolet. So one of the Browns was our family, and one of the Browns was another family. And then later, Grandpa's brother left that company. But even today, it's still called Brown and Browns. So it still has our legacy in the name, even though we're not a part of that car dealership. Anyway, here's a picture of little Bobby Brown and his pappy in Chandler, Arizona. Like I said, Earl Brown didn't love the office life and eventually got a loan and purchased a farm with dairy cows down south in Pomerene, Arizona. This is where Bobby Brown grew up as a farmer boy who learned how to milk cows, handle horses, and live by reaping what you sow. Pomerene was sort of connected across the river to Benson, Arizona, and Bobby went to elementary school in Benson. Here's some old pictures of what Pomerene and Benson looked like while he was living there in those days. Some of the buildings still look a lot like they did back then. The area hasn't really changed a whole lot since they lived there. These are great times in Bobby's childhood. He used to tell me about diving into this pond with a rope swing. And once he dove straight into a school of catfish. And catfish have sort of these stingers on their gills. So when he dove through the school of them, it scared them, and his whole body got covered with stings from their gills. This is possibly also the pond that he told me about, where a number of cattle were sort of standing in it when lightning struck the pond, and it killed every one of them that was standing in it. Grandma Maggie ended up having 8 children, and mostly boys, but Bobby was the second oldest, so he had a lot of responsibility. You can see how happy he looks standing there in the middle. He worked hard, but had a lot of adult experiences. By the time he was 8 years old, he was already driving the big truck around the farm and doing big chores, and while still very young, his dad and uncles taught him all the ways of being a cowboy, including roping, breaking broncs, and training horses. And even though they had trucks and vehicles, they did a lot of work on their horses. In those days, in southern rural Arizona, there was still an element of frontier cowboy life going on. There was still the occasional posse formed to go after bad guys and things like that. Grandpa Brown grew up among some real hardcore cowboys. Here's his dad, and you can see that he was about as cowboy as you can imagine. You've got your standard, very well-trained quarter horse, a Stetson, a pack mule, the good old-fashioned cowboy boots, a good bedroll, a well-coiled rope or a lariat, and a rifle holster, probably carrying a Winchester 94. Almost every cowboy in those days used the Winchester 94. When I look at this picture, you can really feel for poor Earl, trying to make a living in a car dealership in Mesa, but dreaming about buying a farm and getting back on a horse. He just seems to belong up there. Here's Bobby and his brothers and Aunt Maureen in the middle. These are some boys who knew how to work, knew how things worked, and knew how to make a living off the land in one of the driest regions in America, during one of the worst droughts Arizona's had. They all loved sports and were pretty good at them. Bobby played baseball, tennis, basketball, and was trying out to be a high school quarterback when he was tackled illegally and broke his leg. Like I said, there was a major drought in Arizona that occurred between 1942 and 1956, which is when they were down there. It was probably around 1946 that the family had to give up the farm and move back up to the Mesa Chandler area. So Bobby started his freshman and sophomore years down in Pomerene, but finished up high school up north, back up around Mesa, Gilbert, and Queens Creek. World War II had just ended, and a lot of Japanese had been relocated to the southeast of Mesa. Earl purchased a lot of land in Quinn Creek, just enough to live on and to have a cow and a garden, and it was between the Japanese internment camp, which was now empty. Earl purchased a bunch of the old barracks used by the Japanese Americans from the government. He would partially dismantle them, load parts of them onto trucks, modify them, and sell them to farmers as sheds and barns, and sometimes even as homes, probably. This was the family business, and so Bob and his brothers were engaged in it as well for a few years, dismantling these government barracks and trucking them around the region and rebuilding them. When that business died down, Earl used the trucks to make money with his own little trucking company. But they also farmed. They farmed on other people's lots. They were very close to another family that was in the potato farming business. And Quinn Creek potatoes were becoming famous around in the region. And so the Browns also sharecropped with them and grew their own potatoes on that farm. And they probably grew some hay as well. But they just kept that one cow on their lot along with their garden to kind of take care of their personal needs. These were golden years for Bobby. He grew up among a strong, peaceful family who worked and played together, and they also lived among great friends and relatives, many of who had also come up out of the Mexican colonies. He now had 5 brothers and 2 sisters and a very tight, loving family. These were the years he played basketball for his high school team and was also on the track team. He won the state record in pole vault, which he held for a little less than a year before it was broken. And he also threw the javelin and did discus. His uncle ended up being the mission president in Argentina, and his older brother Marvin had the good fortune of being called to serve his mission there under one of their favorite uncles. It's hard to imagine how excited Bobby must have been when he received his own mission call to serve in that very same mission. His uncle even informed him that when he got there, he would be assigned to serve with his brother as his companion, and that they would open a new area together of the mission, which hadn't received the gospel yet. I don't think anyone could have constructed a better dream mission for Bobby than that. He had a very nice farewell for his mission, and then, I think like the next day, he received a draft notice for the Korean War. It had just broken out, and that draft call immediately canceled his mission call. I can't even imagine how heartbroken he must have been. I'm his youngest son, and as I was preparing for my own mission call to Rome, Italy, I was going through an old box and found his old mission journal. The front pages were all filled out with details about his mission call and about his mission farewell, and then every page after that was empty. That really broke my heart. And because of that, during my own mission farewell, I dedicated my mission to him. And I think it meant so much to him that all 5 of his boys all served dedicated, faithful missions all over the world. In fact, all 5 of us served missions in 5 different languages: Indonesian, Spanish, Japanese, Portuguese, and Italian. So let's get caught up with Jennie Hadlock. She was born the same year as Bobby, but up in Salt Lake City. Here's some pictures of what Salt Lake City looked like in the early 1930s. And here are some pictures of her when she was very young. Jennie was the younger child among her big family. Their family was sort of the opposite of the Browns. She was younger, I think second youngest, and they were mostly girls, but also had three boys. Well, Grandpa Brown, or Bobby, was the second oldest, and they were mostly boys. When Jenny was very young, her hair was more blonde, and then it quickly kind of turned brown just as she got older. Jenny's dad had a government job, which allowed them to live more comfortably through the early Depression. They had food and a car, and when others did not. However, they definitely felt the Depression as well. Jenny's idea of a treat was milk, sugar, and bread dipped in together, kind of homemade cereal, I guess. She taught me how to make candy by melting butter and sugar together on a skillet, and that's how they had candy. She also taught us how to put sugar on buttered bread for a quick treat. Her mother was a bit strict and even kind of austere, but her father was a fun, imaginative force in the family. He was often away from home, though, because his job was to travel on the rail lines, sorting and dropping off the mail bags at all the city train stations. Jenny had a good life, and she and her sisters loved to sing and mostly dance. Jenny was a very natural dancer and learned every type of dance she could get her hands and feet on. During World War II, she would participate in the local SOS shows and do the hula for the troops. She told me they would throw their coins up on the stage and then she would collect them. They seemed to really like her. She entered the University of Utah and immediately took every dance class available. The famous Christensen brothers had been trained in Russia in ballet and began the San Francisco Ballet. One brother, Willem, decided to establish a ballet company in Utah, and he started by setting up a world-class dance program at the University of Utah. And Jenny was right there in the middle of it all, and was always in his top classes. He eventually took those dancers and established Ballet West. But by that time, Jenny was about to get married and chose family life over dance. Before college, she went to East High School, and there she was a cheerleader, and then she was also a cheerleader at the University of Utah. Eventually, though, she ran out of dance classes available at the U, and they wouldn't let her retake them. And when she was a cheerleader at the U, she admitted to me that secretly she was always hoping BYU would win when those two teams would play. The LDS Church never had a bigger loyalist than Jenny. She used to tell me that some people have to really work for their testimonies of the church, but for her, she just always knew. She had even volunteered to be a service missionary for the church, on top of all of her dancing and cheerleading. So when the U couldn't offer her any more dance classes, she just transferred to BYU and started taking dance all over again. Meanwhile, down in Arizona, Bobby had just had his heart broken when the draft stopped him from serving his dream mission for the church. He quickly applied to attend BYU instead, because that would allow him to defer his draft, which I think he did twice, and that put him on a crash course to run into Jenny Hadlock. As soon as they met, I think it was at a dance, they immediately fell for each other, and it wasn't long before they were engaged. Jenny's mom was not at all about their marriage. She had had a very hard life as a child and really wanted her daughter to marry rich. I think she was looking for a doctor or a lawyer instead of a sharecropper from Arizona. But Jenny was undaunted, and she knew what she wanted. So in spite of her mother trying to throw a few wrenches into their plans, they had a nice wedding and were sealed in the Salt Lake City temple. On their honeymoon, traveling down through Arizona, they came into a small town that was advertising a rodeo the next day. Jenny had heard about Bobby's expertise with breaking horses and roping cattle, etc., and as a city girl had never really seen that, so she convinced Bobby to enter that rodeo, which he did. Bobby had never had any interest in entering rodeos. His skills had always been for more practical purposes. But he went ahead and won second place for his new bride in the Bronco Buster category. They won a free shopping cart of groceries that they took with them. I can imagine them driving out of the town with a trunk full of groceries with big smiles on their faces. I'll never forget when we made a family visit to Yellowstone, and we all went on a horse ride together there. Dad, on purpose, picked up the one horse that they wouldn't let other tourists ride. and I watched him manage and train that horse the entire time we were on the trip. It was fun to see him use his horse skills in person. As a kid, I was super obsessed with cowboys and never stopped asking him questions about farm and cowboy life. He told me about how there's a certain point where a horse runs at full speed, where everything becomes smooth and peaceful. While on that Yellowstone horse ride toward the end, as we got within sight of the barn, my horse stopped listening to me and took off at a full gallop. It was scary, and I was bouncing all over the place, trying to get him to slow down and hoping not to fall off. But then I remembered what my dad had said and just gave the horse the reins, and it took off at full speed. And then everything happened just like my dad had described. Everything got smooth and peaceful, and I wasn't afraid and just enjoyed the wind and the horse below me. I think I understood my dad more at that moment than maybe any other time. Bobby was always good at Spanish, and for a bunch of cowboys, the Browns loved the arts, music, and literature, and so he chose to get a master's degree in Spanish literature. While finishing up his degree, Bob and Jenny had their first child, Robert Leroy Brown. And after graduating, Bob got his first career job teaching Spanish and English as a second language at a high school in a new city called San Manuel. It was a new city because a big company had built the largest copper mine in the U.S. there, and San Manuel was a city that was built up around the mine to support it. So Bob began teaching school, and on the off season, he would work at the copper mine. And he was also called as the town's bishop at the time. In the copper mine, he would take the elevator down underground, and he would take a rail car to a room carved out of the side of the rock. The room was just large enough for a man to stand and swing a large sledgehammer. On the ground was a grate. A rail car would deliver him a large boulder that he would tip off the rail car onto the grate. Then he would hit that boulder with his large sledgehammer until it all broke up and fell through the grate onto the conveyor belt below. Then he'd tip off another huge boulder and start all over again. He told me that the work would completely exhaust him, and that sometimes he would even be teaching during the day and have to break rocks at night. But he also said he loved it. He said he became massively strong, and that his hands got so calloused they were smooth as leather. And he said he learned to just love the feeling of the rock breaking under his sledgehammer. While in San Manuel, Bob and Jenny had Paul, Cheryl, Roland, and Aaron. For Bob and Jenny, those were probably their hardest years. Bob was extremely busy and hardworking, but Jenny was producing and raising children abundantly on her own without any support system, very far from the big city she grew up in, and very far from her 4 sisters who cared for her and understood her. But then finally a new opportunity arose. Bob discovered a job offering to teach English to locals in Baghdad, Iraq, as part of an embassy program there. Baghdad was not Salt Lake City, but both Bob and Jenny were game for the idea of seeing the world and the adventure that came with it. It also meant normal working hours for Bob and the ability for Jenny to have affordable servants to help raise her kids and maintain her house. Jenny started learning how to thrive living overseas under those types of conditions. And so off to Baghdad they went. It's important to understand that living overseas in the 60s and 70s, especially in undeveloped countries, is an extreme culture shock. All of the normal things you're used to eating, seeing, wearing, smelling, and working with are now completely different and usually not quite as good. And it's all in languages you can't speak or understand. Plus, the culture is so different that it's like being in outer space. It really is a hardship in many ways, but it seemed to be the kind of challenge that Jenny thrived in, and Bob too. For our family, they made living overseas an adventure. They made the most of it and made sure their children experienced as much of the real culture as possible. Jenny constantly bought up cultural memorabilia and surrounded her family with exotic memories. While in Baghdad, Cheryl was baptized in the Tigris River, and as you can see in this picture, Jennie became pregnant with me and gave birth to me in 1966. That's why I carry the name Jared Jamal. Jamal is Arabic and means handsome and was the name of a popular Arab prince at the time. And Jared was given me because we lived where some people believe the Tower of Babel was. Since then, I've come to this very strong conclusion that the Tower of Babel was actually up in eastern Turkey, but I still love my name. I did actually a video on my YouTube channel on a series on Abraham, Melchizedek, and Shem, if you're interested in figuring out why it was very likely up in Turkey. I think it's an interesting video series if you want to kind of change your paradigm about where Abraham grew up and the people who surrounded him. When I became about a year old or so, the Six-Day War broke out, and it was between Israel and the entire Arab world. And there we were sitting in the middle of Baghdad, and it was no secret that the U.S. supported Israel. So things became very sketchy and sort of hostile for us to be in Baghdad. And we had to sneak out of the city, leave all of our stuff behind at the home, get in a car with other embassy folks in the middle of the night, sort of quietly without our lights on, sneak out into the desert until we got far enough away to where an airplane could land in the desert and pick us up. We had to get rid of our cars. I think we traded ours for a Persian rug. And we were taken to Tehran, Iran, which is Persian, not Arab. And Tehran at the time was very friendly to the U.S. And so we stayed there in Tehran until Dad got a new embassy assignment to Bogota, Colombia. So off to Bogota, Colombia we went. Bogota is a kind of a mountainous, cool area that had kind of chilly winters, kind of rainy, and sometimes it would get hail. We had a fairly good life there for a few years. We had the servants that helped raise us that made life great for Mom. And Mom very quickly established the garage as her dance studio where she began to teach dance. I was raised by a manservant, and because of that, I actually was bilingual in Spanish as I learned to speak. We had some good years in Bogota, but before too long, we moved to Fairfax, Virginia, so Dad could work at the State Department, where he could prepare to serve in Indonesia and to learn the language. So we lived in Fairfax and had some nice memories there for about a year or so before we went to Jakarta, Indonesia. Jakarta is a gigantic city. Today, it's all tall buildings, but at the time there was only one really tall building called the Toyota Building and one really big hotel called Hotel Indonesia. The embassy was large, and there was a very big American, British, and Australian presence there because our countries were involved in Indonesia's oil business. That big English-speaking presence in that very exotic land made for an incredibly rich experience for our family. Our posting there was only 2 or 3 years, but we loved it so much that Dad was able to stretch it out and make it a full 5 years. I think for everyone in our family, including the parents, we would consider Jakarta to be our golden years, where we were all together as a family for a good chunk of time. Indonesian was a very foreign, but not too difficult language. The people were kind and gentle. The LDS branch was large enough to be a family, and most of the English-speaking culture there was absolutely amazing. We had a huge American club with an Olympic swimming pool, diving boards, movie theater, restaurant, women's clubs, recreation facilities, basketball courts, tennis courts, and the entire club was surrounded by homes used by embassy employees. In other words, their backyards were the American club. We had such a big family that we lived elsewhere, but not too far away. We lived in a big Dutch home with 2 separate upstairs areas. We had a driver who acted as a gardener and a security guard. We had another live-in maid and a second maid who came in to help her out. Our mom didn't have to do any laundry, cleaning, cooking, or even driving. We would wake up and have all our lunches made for school. We'd come home from school and our rooms were all cleaned and our laundry folded away and put in our drawers. Dinner would just show up on our large dining room table at night, and we knew when it was dinner time when somebody hit the big gong in our living room. This is the gong that I think Tikla has now. We would all come down and kneel at our chairs for family prayer. We would eat, and then the maids would clear the table and handle the dishes. Sometimes we'd stay at that table and play games like I Doubt It or Spoons. We had probably the best school system in Jakarta that exists anywhere in the world. It was large and excellent quality. Because of the large British population there, we had outstanding musicals and plays and other activities. The older siblings were in a world-class high school choir called Joint Sounds, and they also had choirs for the younger crowd that I participated in. I think Aaron did too. The plays and musicals put on at that school were unbelievably good, and we were always involved in them. I can't remember her name, but this woman here was an incredible artistic force that raised the quality of the music and the plays at the school to a very high level. For all the musicals, Mom was always the choreographer, and the big school musicals were always a family affair. Even though I was only in elementary school, I was even able to be in one of the big plays as Annie Oakley's little brother. That was a huge honor for me. By the time we left Indonesia, only Aaron and I were left with our parents to go to Porto Alegre, Brazil. Porto Alegre is a busy city south of Brazil, just across the border from Argentina. The school was not ideal, and we were only in a small consulate. We played a lot of tennis and a lot of rook. Aaron and I grew closer together and to our parents, but there was not much else for us. The English school was extremely small and had very little to offer. So within 6 months or so, Dad jumped at an opening at the embassy in Brasilia. Brasilia is the capital of Brazil, and it had a strong American and international community there with a very good school. And we even lived among a community of Americans in a couple big apartment buildings that the embassy owned that were all right next to each other. That was a really good time for Aaron and me. It was night and day better than Porto Alegre. And Aaron and I sort of had our own little golden age there. We could not have been happier or had more fun. Mother was a huge, huge sports fan, and it's hard to describe what a big deal soccer was in our lives, especially during the World Cup. We were there to experience one of Brazil's greatest international soccer teams during an epic World Cup. I was there through middle school, and Aaron was in high school. Our last year there, both Aaron and I decided that we didn't want to completely miss out on American high school. So we both left our parents to finish their last year in Brazil, and we stayed with our Aunt Esther in Salt Lake and went to Highland High. I was a freshman there, and Aaron graduated there. It was hard to be away from our parents, but I think we both really appreciated just having the experience of real football games and sock hops and that type of thing. After Brazil, Aaron went off to college, and I went with my parents to Burke, Virginia, which is basically in the Fairfax area. I finished my last 3 years of high school there, while Dad worked at the State Department. Even though I was alone, I had a great ward and a great group of friends there. I personally really thrived and developed my own personal relationship with my parents, living with them for 3 years, all alone. After I left for BYU and eventually my mission to Italy, Mom and Dad had moved to a post in Managua, Nicaragua. It was a politically and geologically torn area. It had suffered a massive earthquake, and Managua hadn't been completely rebuilt. It was certainly another hardship post, which is what they seemed to prefer because Dad got paid more, and they didn't seem to mind being a little bit more rundown areas. By this time, Jennie had sort of hardened as a diplomat wife and was able to make the most of that experience. They then went to Monterrey, Mexico, and by this time Bob was a more senior diplomat, and even though it was only a consulate, it was a very important consulate, and he was the head of his own department there. They had a very nice home, which they renovated, and because it was close to the U.S., Aaron and I were able to visit them multiple times. This was their final overseas post together, and they enjoyed it there and finished strong. Knowing I was planning on working in D.C. as I was finishing my master's in public policy, my parents decided to take their last post in the D.C. area so that they could be there with Anne and my two kids, Anthony and Audra. So while Dad finished his diplomatic career, my little family lived with them while I interned in D.C. and tried to begin a career. All four of my little family lived in one room in their condo in a tall building in Alexandria, Virginia. It was tight quarters, but it was also a really great time. Anne and Jenny got along, and Jenny loved having total access to Anthony and Audra. She would take them down to the pool, to the playground, and to the zoo, and all the normal fun things that Jenny always came up with for her little kids and grandkids. Anne taught dance classes at the time, which of course tied her to Jenny even closer. They had actually both trained under the same Willem Christensen who founded Ballet West, so they had that tie. When I got my first job with Senator Hatch and we moved into our townhome, we were able to continue to be close to them. After Bob's retirement, they both ended up back in Utah. They had just come home from a beautiful cruise with Mom's sisters and husbands and had a wonderful romantic time. They were staying with Aunt Esther, as we always did, when Mom had her final asthma attack and passed away. That ended the worldly relationship of Bob and Jenny, but it was just the beginning of an outstanding legacy that has exceeded their wildest possible dreams. It's a legacy worth knowing about and worth keeping in our hearts.